You ever wonder what really happens on those lonely, winding mountain highways? The ones no GPS can save you from once the sun drops and the fog rolls in. Tonight we're diving into 10 true trucker horror stories that were whispered over radios, left scribbled in logbooks, or never spoken of again. Haunted tunnels, vanishing taillights, CB radios that echo back voices that shouldn't be there. If you're ready for the ride, hit that like button. It helps this story reach more horror fans like you. Comment where you're watching from. Every viewer is part of my horror family, and I want to know where you're tuning in from. Tell me which story hit you the hardest. And most of all, subscribe. It helps us keep these terrifying stories rolling. Let's get scared together. I've spent most of my life driving long haul through the Appalachians. Nights on the road blur together, miles of twisting blacktop, deer darting through headlights, the occasional gas station lit up like an island. But there's one night I'll never forget, and even now, years later, the memory of it creeps back whenever the fog settles thick in the valleys. It was late autumn, close to winter. My logbook had me running a route out of Kentucky, threading east into West Virginia. I'd miscalculated my time and ended up pushing through a mountain pass at 2 in the morning. The fog was so heavy, it seemed to crawl into the cab through the vents. My high beams only made it worse, so I kept the lights low, rolling at maybe 25 miles an hour. The road was slick, glistening with mist. The kind of night where you feel like you're the only living soul in 100 miles. Then I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a shape in the fog. A figure standing off the shoulder, waving one arm slowly like he was signaling for help. My chest clenched. Out there that late, there aren't many good reasons for someone to be on foot, and none of them end well. I slowed down, eased onto the gravel shoulder, and put the hazards on. The red lights flickered against the fog, making everything pulse. When I stepped out of the truck, the air hit me, wet, cold, smelling faintly of pine and something sour, like damp leaves rotting under the soil. I looked across the road where I'd seen him, but there was nothing, just fog drifting low across the brush. "Hello?" My voice sounded swallowed, like the fog absorbed it. Nothing answered. I was about to climb back in when I noticed the ground. The gravel shoulder was soaked, darkened from the mist, and across it ran a line of wet footprints. Bare feet, wide steps like a man's. They led away from the road, across the shoulder, through some weeds, and toward the cliff's edge. I followed them, careful, boots crunching on wet rock. My flashlight beam cut through just enough to show the prints glistening, darker than the stone, each one fresh like they'd been pressed moments before. But when they reached the edge, where the land just dropped away into a hollow, they stopped. No skid marks, no slide, no disturbance in the moss along the edge, just stopped. I leaned out slightly, but the fog was too thick to see anything below. My stomach twisted. Behind me, the truck's engine idled steady, the hazards ticking. The sound felt a mile away. I remember looking back at the cab, warm light spilling from the open door, then back down at those vanishing prints. A cold unease crept up my spine. I told myself maybe he'd climbed down. People did reckless things when they were desperate, but there was no scuff, no handprint, nothing to show he'd lowered himself. It was as though he'd walked right into the air and disappeared. I stood there too long, feeling the mist cling to my jacket, my boots sinking slightly into the mud. Something about the silence pressed in harder than usual. No crickets, no wind, not even the groan of trees, just my own breathing. Eventually, I forced myself back into the cab. My hands shook on the wheel. As I eased back onto the road, the fog seemed thicker, almost alive, curling around the truck. Every curve after that felt sharper, every shadow heavier. The miles dragged, and all I could think about were those bare footprints ending where there should have been ground. That night, I didn't stop again until I was clear of the pass. But the image stuck, the man waving, the trail of wet prints, the way they ended at nothing. Even then, I felt something wasn't right, something I couldn't put words to, and the worst part was knowing I hadn't imagined it. The gravel on my boots, damp and dark, proved that much. A week passed before I drove that road again, I told myself I wouldn't think about it, that I'd keep my head down and treat it like any other stretch of road. But by the time I reached that St. Pass, a tightness had already settled in my chest. The fog was lighter this time, but the memory weighed heavier. I slowed near the shoulder where I'd seen him, my eyes scanning the brush. Nothing, just slick rock and pine needles. Still, I pulled over. Something in me needed to. The gravel crunched under my boots again as I crossed to the same spot. I half expected the footprints to be waiting for me, but of course, the ground was clean, just weeds and mud. The cliff's edge was there, steep and unforgiving, the valley yawning below. The air smelled the same, pine and rot, that faint sourness of things long decayed. I crouched, studying the edge. That's when I noticed it. A scrap of fabric, caught on a thorn bush, just a foot from the drop, faded red, stiff with damp, like it had been there for days. I held it up, and it looked like part of a shirt sleeve. The sight hit me harder than it should have. I shoved it into my pocket and stepped back, but something else caught my eye low in the weeds, half buried in mud. A notebook. It was swollen with water damage, the cover peeling away, but still intact enough to open. Inside, the pages were warped, smeared with ink, but I could make out fragments, scrawled words, dates. The handwriting was uneven, jagged. The entries spoke of walking, of being watched, of hearing things in the woods at night. Then they shifted, more frantic, talking about roads that don't end, about someone waving him down, about bare feet. My throat went dry, reading that. The last legible page ended mid-sentence, water stains, bleeding the words into nothing. I stuffed the notebook back into my jacket, suddenly desperate to be away from that place. My boots slipped slightly in the mud, and for a moment, I pictured myself tumbling over the edge, vanishing the same way those footprints had. Back in the cab, I sat for a long time without starting the engine. My hands smelled of damp paper and soil. The fabric scrap weighed heavy in my pocket. I've never shown anyone that notebook. It's still tucked away in a drawer at home. The pages stiff with mold now. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I pull it out and reread those They never make more sense. If anything, they unsettle me more. Like the words are less about him, and more about me. Like I wasn't the first driver to stop, and maybe I won't be the last. Even now, every time I take that pass, I slow down near the spot. I tell myself it's just habit, but really, I'm looking for that figure in the fog, looking for prints that end where they shouldn't. And the worst part, some nights, when the fog is heavy enough, I swear I catch it, just for a moment, a shape on the roadside, one arm raised, waiting. I don't stop anymore, but I still see him. I've driven trucks through the Appalachian passes for most of my adult life, and I've learned that the mountains carry their own kind of silence. Sometimes it's the silence of fog, swallowing everything. Other times it's the silence that comes after a rock slide, when the air feels bruised, like it's waiting for another shift. But the silence that night was heavier, close against the cab windows, as if the road itself was holding its breath. I was hauling lumber out of a mill near Hazard, Kentucky, pushing east toward North Carolina. It was past midnight, and the two-lane roads wound like snakes across the ridges. The trailer behind me was full of pine boards, strapped and stacked, heavy enough that the truck groaned on every climb. I'd hauled the same route before, but the fog was thick that night, lying low across the valleys and blinding the high beams. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping from the trailer. At first it sounded like loose cargo shifting, a board vibrating against the wall of the trailer whenever I hit a bend. That wasn't unusual. You can strap down lumber a dozen ways and still have something creak loose when the air's wet enough. I slowed down, thinking it would settle, but then the tapping grew clearer. It wasn't random. It came in sets, 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. My chest tightened. I checked the mirrors, but the trailer was just a hulking shadow in the fog. I cracked the window. The air outside smelled of wet pine diesel and something sour like rotting bark. The sound was sharper now, carrying even through the engine. I told myself it was the road board shifting when the truck leaned, but then the rhythm changed. The knocking grew steady, a dull pounding that kept time with the thump in my chest. Every beat of my pulse seemed echoed by a knock in the trailer. Slow, heavy, relentless. I gripped the wheel harder. My breathing grew shallow. I shut off the radio so I could listen. Nothing but the drone of the tires, and that rhythm, like someone or something inside the trailer was matching me breath for breath, heartbeat for heartbeat. At a turnout near a broken-down sign for Claypool Gap, I pulled over. The gravel shoulder crunched under the weight of the rig. I sat for a moment with the hazards clicking, the red glow flickering against the fog. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Finally, I climbed down and walked to the trailer. The air was colder outside, damp enough to beat across my face. Owls called from deep in the hollow, their cries stretching thin. I unlocked the back latch and yanked the door open. My flashlight cut through rows of stacked boards, banded in place. Nothing had shifted. Everything was tight, wedged into the steel ribs. The air inside was thick with sap and mold, like wet wood left too long in the rain. I stepped back, shining the light along the exterior walls. No dents, no scratches, just condensation rolling down the steel. Still, the pounding continued, muffled, as if it were coming from inside the lumber itself. My gut twisted. I slammed the doors shut and locked them. Back in the cab, I sat staring at the dark windshield. The pounding had stopped, replaced by the thin whine of the engine fan. I waited 10 minutes, then 20. Nothing. The road ahead was just fog and shadow, but the silence pressed harder than the sound had. Finally, I eased back onto the road. My knuckles were white against the wheel, but as the truck picked up speed, the pounding started again, slow, steady, falling into time with my pulse, and this time, no matter how tightly I gripped the wheel, I couldn't convince myself it was just the load shifting. The pounding followed me for miles. Every curve, every straightaway, the knocks kept time with my body, until it felt less like sound and more like something inside me answering back. I wanted to pull over again, unload the whole trailer board by board, but it was near 2 in the morning, and I was deep in the ridges where there wasn't a house light for miles. By the time I reached a little crossroads near an abandoned gas station, the pounding slowed, then stopped. My body didn't believe it. My heartbeat was still racing, waiting for the rhythm to return. I parked under a broken street lamp and walked the length of the trailer again. The fog had thinned just enough for the lamp to spread a weak yellow glow across the steel. That's when I noticed it. On the condensation near the back door, smears. Long, uneven streaks where the moisture had been wiped away. They looked like handprints dragged down the metal, fingers spread. I touched the marks. The steel was cold, slick with fog. But the streaks were warmer, faintly sticky, like the sap that oozes from cut pine. My throat tightened. I unlocked the doors again, this time more slowly. The hinges groaned as I pulled them open. The beam of my flashlight swept the stacks of lumber. They stood solid, neat rows, but something was different. Near the bottom of one stack, a single board jutted slightly out of line, as if it had been shoved from inside. I crouched down. My knees pressed into damp gravel. The board had a crack running through the center. The wood splintered, stained darker than sap. When I leaned closer, the smell hit me, sharp, metallic, sour, almost like rust. The pounding started again, softer this time, like a slow drumbeat coming from the middle of the stack. My chest tightened. My flashlight shook in my hand. For a moment I thought about prying that board loose, about digging into the load until I found the source. But my body refused. Something deep inside me told me that if I pulled even one board free, I'd find something I wasn't meant to. I slammed the doors shut again and drove. The rest of the route blurred. I don't remember the curves, don't remember the small towns I passed through. All I remember is gripping the wheel so hard my palms went raw. The pounding faded once the sky began to pale, like whatever was inside the trailer had grown quiet with the dawn. By the time I reached the drop yard in Asheville, my body felt hollow. I signed the papers, backed the rig into its slot, and left the trailer behind. I didn't stay to watch them unload it. I didn't want to, but I've thought about it ever since. I never saw a report. No calls about damaged boards or anything strange in the shipment. If anyone found something inside, it was kept quiet. Still, when I close my eyes, I see those hand smears in the condensation, the board jutting out as if someone had tried to push it free. Sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I swear I can still hear it, the dull, steady pounding. Not from outside, not from memory, but from somewhere inside my own chest, and it always falls into rhythm with my heartbeat. I'd been hauling flooring beams out of Bristol, heading northeast toward a mill town that most folks don't bother naming anymore. It was just after midnight, the kind of stretch where the mountain fog folds in low and heavy, curling around the road like damp sheets. I'd been driving long enough to know that up in the Appalachians, the night never feels empty. It presses on you, smothering quiet, broken only by the occasional whip of a branch or the muffled hoot of an owl. I first noticed the truck behind me just past Saltville. Old-style headlights, dimmer than most, hanging far back in the mist. Out here, you don't ignore another rig keeping pace with you for miles. It felt less like coincidence, and more like intention. The CB was dead quiet. I tried clicking over to a few channels, just to test the water, but nothing came back. That wasn't unusual. Plenty of nights you can drive these mountains and never hear another voice, but with that truck shadowing me, the silence felt heavier. By the time I climbed into Tazewell County, the fog was thick enough that my own beams just bounced back at me. Every curve, every bend in that narrow road, I kept catching the glow of his headlights pressing through the mist. Always the same distance. Never closer, never farther. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just riding careful, taking the same pass I was. But the longer it went, the more it wore on me. I couldn't shake the thought that he wasn't just following the road, he was following me. I found a pull-off near a gravel logging spur and swung my truck over. My plan was simple. Step out, wave him past, maybe ask if he needed help. I left my rig idling, hazard lights clicking. The fog swallowed everything. I stood there, waiting for his headlights to crest around the bend, but they didn't. The curve behind me was empty. No beams, no low growl of a diesel. The night pressed in, thick and wet, smelling of pine and rot. I waited a long time, long enough that the hazard lights started to feel unnaturally loud in the stillness. Click, click, click. Finally, I climbed back into the cab, shutting the door harder than I meant to. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that exhaustion was making shadows into trucks, but as I rolled out, my mirrors caught something that made my chest tighten. A faint, wet streak across my trailer's side, like a hand dragged through condensation. It wasn't there when I stopped, and it trailed off into the darkness, where the road disappeared into fog. I kept driving, but I couldn't settle. My eyes kept darting to the mirror, expecting those dim headlights to return. They never did. The road unspooled ahead, twisting through hollows, the kind of stretches where you could believe no one else on earth was alive. The streak on my trailer gnawed at me. At the next turnout, I killed the engine and stepped down with my flashlight. The gravel crunched under my boots, damp and uneven. When I swept the beam across the trailer's aluminum siding, my stomach turned. There weren't just one or two streaks, there were several, parallel, uneven, like fingers pressed hard enough to leave tracks in the wet. They all dragged forward, toward the cab. I followed them, each breath colder than the last. The smell of wet pine needles hung heavy, sharp in my nose. At the trailer's front, just behind the cab, the streaks ended in smeared palm marks, almost frantic. I spun the light into the trees. Nothing. Just fog swirling slow through black trunks. I climbed back in, locked the doors, and forced the rig back onto the highway. But the rhythm of the road couldn't steady me. Every bump made me think of knuckles rapping. Every hiss of the brakes sounded like breathing. The closer I got to town, The more the fog thinned, but the unease didn't. By the time I pulled into the mill lot, dawn was starting to break, pale and gray. One of the yardmen waved me into position. As I rolled to a stop, he circled the trailer, clipboard in hand. Then he froze. He squatted low, running his fingers over something near the trailer's undercarriage. I climbed down, throat tight. There, smeared along the metal lip of the undercarriage, was mud, thick, wet, fresh, and wedged into a seam was something worse, a torn strip of fabric, plaid, soaked through. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. He just handed me the clipboard, eyes a little too wide, and walked off. I signed, dropped the load, and drove away. That was 3 years ago. I still haul the mountains, but I don't take that stretch at night anymore. I can't. The thought of headlights in the fog makes my skin crawl, and every now and then, when the mist rolls in heavy, I'll catch myself checking the mirrors, looking for a truck that isn't there. Or worse, looking for handprints I can't explain. I've been driving trucks up and down the Appalachians for close to 15 years. Anyone who's worked these mountains knows you start paying attention to the CB chatter as much as you watch the road. Most nights, it's the usual noise. Guys trading jokes, griping about dispatch, or warning about deer on the shoulder. But that night, cutting across a fog-choked stretch near Boone, it was different. The CB had been quiet for hours. I remember rolling my window down a little, just to break the silence with the hiss of wet air rushing in. Then it crackled alive with a sudden sharpness that startled me. A man's voice, low and tired, almost like he was whispering straight into my cab. "Watch out on Dead Man's Curve." That was it. No handle, no channel ID, just the words, and then static. The name hit me in the chest. Every mountain driver knows Dead Man's Curve. A tight blind bend clinging to the side of a hollow that drops off 50, maybe 60 feet. Guardrail's been bent for years, like a drunk leaning against a bar. Folks say more accidents happen there than anywhere else in the county. I reached for the mic, thumbed the button. Copy that. Who's calling? Nothing. Just the faint hiss of dead air. The road narrowed as the fog thickened. Pines leaned over me, their tops lost in a pale blur of moonlight. My wipers dragged across glass smeared with drizzle, the rubber squealing. That sound has always made me uneasy, like something crying. As I eased closer to the curve, my headlights washed across the guardrail, wet and rust-streaked. My stomach knotted. Fresh skid marks tore across the asphalt, still black against the gray road like paint not yet dry. They cut sharp toward the outside edge. I slowed to a crawl, heart hammering. The tracks went straight over. I pulled the rig onto the shoulder, set the brake, and climbed down. The gravel crunched under my boots, softened by mud. The air smelled of wet leaves and rusting metal, heavy and damp. At the rail's edge, I looked down. The hollow opened below like a dark mouth. Mist moved slow and silent, filling the valley floor so I couldn't see more than 20 feet. I expected twisted metal, glass, maybe a truck's cab light glowing through the fog. But there was nothing. No wreckage, no movement. Just the hush of rain dripping from branches, and the faint rush of water somewhere deep below. The silence pressed hard, like the whole mountain was listening. I stayed there longer than I meant to, staring, waiting for something, any sign of a vehicle, but the hollow stayed empty. When I finally climbed back in my cab, my hands shook so bad I had trouble shifting. The CB sat quiet on the dash, the green light steady as ever. I wanted to turn it off, but couldn't. I needed to know if that voice came back. It never did. I kept rolling, but the night had changed. Every bend, every shadowed stretch of trees felt wrong, like the mountains were holding something I wasn't meant to see. By the time I pulled off near an old cabin rest stop farther up the ridge, I couldn't shake the picture of those skid marks leading nowhere. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, but the dread sat deep, unmoving, like a stone in my chest. The cabin wasn't much, one of those roadside stops truckers use when weather turns. A sagging roof, porch light burned out years ago, the wood swollen with rain. Inside smelled of mildew and smoke long gone cold, but it was dry. and the road outside felt too alive with silence, so I stayed. I laid down on the narrow cot, still in my jacket. The drip of water through the roof kept me half awake, and somewhere around 3 a.m. the CB crackled again. Same voice, low, flat. Dead man's curve. Watch out. I sat up so fast my head hit the wall. My rig was parked 50 feet outside. I hadn't left the radio on. I was sure of it, but I could hear the words as clear as before, like they'd slipped through the walls of the cabin itself. I didn't sleep after that, just sat, listening to the dark until the first gray light bled into the trees. By morning, the fog had thinned. I drove back down toward the curve. Curiosity or stupidity, I don't know which. The skid marks were still there, bold and fresh, but something new stopped me cold. On the inside of the guardrail, where the tracks began, lay a single object, a CB microphone. It was old, the chrome dulled cord frayed where it had been ripped loose. I crouched, picked it up. The plastic was wet but warm, as if someone had just let go of it. I dropped it quick, and looked over the edge again. Morning mist still clung to the hollow, but now I noticed a narrow path leading down through the brush, beaten into mud by something heavy, like tires or boots. I didn't follow, couldn't. My gut screamed not to. Instead, I drove on, but the road never felt the same. Every time I passed that bend now, my eyes lock on the guardrail, waiting. Some nights, I swear I hear the voice again, carried faint through static even with my CB switched off. I've stopped pulling over to check. I don't want to know what waits down in that hollow, or who keeps warning me. The skid marks have faded since, worn by rain and traffic, but I still see them in my head. Black streaks ending at the edge, pointing into nothing. And that's the part I can't let go of. Someone went over that rail, but nothing was ever found. No wreck, no body, just a voice that keeps calling out the same warning, as if I'm next to repeat the path. I've driven a lot of roads, seen plenty of wrecks, but this is the only one that follows me home, into sleep, into silence. The mountains don't let go of what they take, and I think one night, Dead Man's Curve is going to take me too. I was hauling a small load of scrap metal over Black Hollow Pass, the kind of switchback mountain road that doesn't show up on tourist maps. The radio had already warned about a winter storm moving in from the east, but I thought I could beat it. That's the arrogance you get after years of driving alone through the mountains, thinking the roads are yours. By the time I crested the pass, the snow had started to fall harder. Thick flakes hit the windshield like wet feathers, and the wipers squealed against the glass. I pulled over onto a wide gravel turnout near a ridge, mostly because I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me. The cab filled with a dull quiet. No trucks, no distant cars, no wildlife sounds, just the wind rattling through the spruce trees. I kept the engine running, heater on low, hands thawing against the vents. It smelled faintly of hot antifreeze and stale coffee. I must have dozed off. It happens more often than I'd like to admit. When I woke, my first thought was that something had gone terribly wrong. My breath came out in pale bursts, fogging the glass. The engine had died, and the silence was suffocating. Even the wind seemed to have disappeared, leaving only the tick of cooling metal under the hood. I tried the ignition, but it wouldn't turn over. The dashboard stayed dark, lifeless. A truck cab without heat in sub-zero weather becomes an icebox in minutes. My fingers already ached when I wrapped them around the wheel. That's when I noticed it. A sound low, steady. The rhythm of it was unmistakable. Breathing, not mine. Not shallow or panicked, but calm, slow, measured. The kind of breathing you hear when someone's asleep right beside you. It was behind me. The sleeper berth was dark. Just a mess of rumpled blankets and a half-empty thermos. I hadn't had a passenger in years, not since my brother rode with me a decade back. Still, the sound was there, air moving in and out, brushing against the silence like sandpaper. I didn't turn around right away. My body went rigid, heart hammering, skin prickling beneath my jacket. I told myself it was in my head, I was tired, hair half frozen, maybe still half dreaming. But then there was a faint shift in the blankets, just enough fabric movement to catch the corner of my eye. I twisted in the seat, slow, deliberate. The bunk was empty, but the blankets were pulled to one side, like someone had been lying there only moments before. A sour smell hung in the air. Damp fabric, old sweat, something metallic beneath it. I'd been alone the entire trip, yet it felt like I'd just missed someone climbing out of that bed. The breathing had stopped. I sat there, engine dead, snow pressing against the windows, my cab suddenly feeling too small. The longer I stared into that dark space behind the seats, the less certain I became about what I'd heard. Maybe it was wind through the vents. Maybe it was me. But the blankets, the smell, the silence that followed, something about it was wrong. I didn't sleep again that night. The storm swallowed the mountain road completely. I sat wrapped in my jacket, every breath stinging my lungs, watching the world outside my windshield vanish into a white curtain. My phone had no signal, the CB nothing but static. All I had was the truck, the cold, and that bunk behind me. The smell lingered. It wasn't the truck's usual mix of diesel and coffee. It was sharper, like wet iron, mixed with mildew. Every so often, I thought I caught the faintest trace of something sweet rotting, like fruit left too long in a damp cellar. I tried not to look back, but my eyes kept dragging toward the bunk. The blankets weren't lying flat anymore. They had bunched up differently, like weight had pressed into them and then rolled away. I told myself fabric shifts with vibration, with my own movement, with cold. But the engine wasn't running. Nothing had moved except me. Hours passed that way, me staring forward, fighting the urge to glance back. The snow piled higher, swallowing the truck to the wheel wells. I could hear it creaking faintly against the frame, heavy and damp. At some point, exhaustion won. My eyes closed against my will. I woke with a start when something brushed my collar, not hard, just a whisper of contact, like fingers grazing fabric. I whipped around so fast my neck cracked. No one, but the blankets had slid almost to the floor. I don't remember deciding to get out. I just remember the door handle burning cold against my palm, and the crunch of snow swallowing me up to the knee. The storm blinded me, flakes biting into my face. But I couldn't stay in that cab any longer. There was an old timber-lined shack maybe 30 yards off the turnout, half collapsed under the snow. I stumbled inside. The place smelled worse than the cab, rot, wet wood, and something animal. The floor was warped, the windows punched out, but at least it was shelter. In the corner sat a broken chair and a table. On the table, a tin coffee cup still sat upright, rim rusted. Next to it was a faded photograph, water-stained but intact enough to see a man in a trucker's cap, standing in front of a rig nearly identical to mine. My chest locked up. On the back, in smeared pencil, someone had scrawled, "Kept me warm that night." I left the shack and trudged back to the truck, half delirious. When I pulled open the cab door, the first thing I noticed was heat. The engine was still dead, but the cab felt warm, too warm, like someone had been breathing in it for hours. The blankets were neatly spread again, as if waiting. I sat in the driver's seat until dawn, unable to move, unable to think. When the plows finally reached me, I left the truck where it was, told the company the engine froze, never mentioned the rest. I've driven hundreds of hauls since then, but I never sleep in the cab anymore. Motels, rest stops, anywhere but that dark space behind me. Because sometimes, in the quiet stretches of highway, I swear I hear it again. Steady, patient breathing, just behind my seat. And every time, the warmth spreads through the cab like someone never left. I've been driving trucks through the mountains for over 20 years, and I've never been superstitious. Roads are roads. People are people. You keep your eyes open, your hands steady, and you'll make it where you're going. But there's one night I can't explain. Even now, sitting in the quiet of my small house, I can close my eyes and see those dark walls of rock pressing in, the wet smell of mud, the headlights that shouldn't have been there. It was late October, and I had a short run to make, delivering construction equipment through a stretch of the Appalachian backroads. My dispatcher warned me about rain on the ridges, so I was already on edge when I turned off the main highway and onto a 2-lane that wound through the mountains. No cell service out there, just a line of faded signs for towns whose names felt half forgotten: Wolf Run, Little Laurel, Sugar Creek. Fog clung low over the valleys, swirling between the trees like smoke from a dying fire. My headlights cut narrow beams through it, catching raindrops and slick bark. The road itself narrowed the deeper I went. The painted lines faded to nothing. The mountains rose on either side, and before long I was threading a canyon, barely wide enough for the truck, with jagged walls of rock dripping with moss and runoff. That's when I saw them. Headlights in my mirror. At first it was just a glow like someone's brights bouncing in the fog. Then clearer, 2 sharp beams, following tight behind me, closer than made sense on a road that narrow. I checked my speed, 30, steady. No reason for anyone to ride my bumper like that. I thought about pulling to the side, but there wasn't a shoulder, just wet rock and drops into shadow. I drove another half-mile, nerves knotting tighter, waiting for some chance to let them pass. And then I came around a wide bend, the canyon walls opening just enough to glance behind me. The road was gone, not empty, gone. Where there should have been black tops stretching back through the canyon, there was only solid rock, like the wall had closed behind me. I slowed to a crawl, staring into the mirror. Nothing but dripping stone. My mouth went dry. I pulled into the first turnout I saw, a flat patch of dirt with a half-collapsed guardrail, and killed the engine. Rain pattered on the cab roof. The silence pressed in. I opened the door and stepped out, boots sinking into mud. The smell of wet iron and old leaves filled the air. The canyon behind me looked normal now, just a dark road curving back into fog. But I swear, when I came through that bend, there hadn't been any road at all. I walked a few feet toward it, gravel crunching under my boots, and stopped. The fog thickened, curling like smoke around the rock face. It was too quiet. No crickets, no drip of water, just the sound of my own breathing. When I turned back toward the truck, I noticed something else. On the guardrail, rusted and bent, sat a photograph under the wet leaves. An old black and white, edges curled from moisture. I picked it up. It showed a man standing in front of a cabin. His face was pale, features blurred, like the exposure had gone wrong. Behind him, the cabin leaned sideways, roof sagging, woods pressing close. I don't know why, but the image chilled me more than the headlights had. I set it back where I found it, and climbed into the cab. My hands shook as I started the engine again. I told myself I'd just been tired, the rain distorting the mirror, the canyon walls messing with depth, but a heaviness lingered, a quiet dread I couldn't shake. I kept driving, deeper into the mountains, wondering if I should have turned around when I had the chance. The road carried me higher, into the mist. Rain slicked the black top, and turned every curve into a blind corner. My wipers beat a steady rhythm, but the fog kept closing in, so thick I couldn't see more than 30 feet ahead. I kept catching myself glancing in the mirror, expecting those headlights to flare back to life. But the road behind stayed dark. About an hour in, I saw another turnout, this one marked by a wooden sign leaning at an angle, letters so faded they were barely legible. I made out Fletcher Hollow. I'd never heard of it. The turnout ended in a dirt track, almost overgrown, leading downhill. I told myself not to stop again, but when my headlights swept across the path, they caught on something. A mailbox, rusted, leaning sideways, the flag broken. Something about it tugged at me. Against my better judgment, I pulled in. The track was rough, mud sucking at my tires, branches scraping the sides. It wound down maybe 100 yards before opening into a clearing. There was a cabin there. It looked like the one from the photograph. Same sagging roof, same crooked chimney. The porch tilted forward, boards warped with rain. A faint smell of rot drifted on the damp air. I cut the engine and sat in silence, listening. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I don't know what I expected. Maybe signs of life, maybe nothing. but I opened the door and stepped out anyway, boots sinking into soft earth. The cabin door hung slightly ajar, creaking with each gust of wind. I hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with mold. My flashlight beam caught a table covered in dust. Chairs collapsed against the wall. A stove rusted through. The floor sagged under my weight. On the far wall, nailed crooked above the fireplace, was another photograph. The same man, standing in front of the same cabin, but this time closer. His blurred face seemed almost melted, unrecognizable. I stepped closer, heart pounding, when I noticed something at the base of the fireplace. A pair of boots, caked with dried mud, laces frayed. They looked recent, not decades old like the rest of the cabin. That was when the sound reached me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind the cabin, crunching on wet leaves. I killed the flashlight and froze, breath caught in my throat. The steps circled around the side, pausing near the porch. Whoever it was didn't come in. After a long minute, the sound faded back into the woods. I stayed there in the dark, every nerve screaming, until the silence felt unbearable. Then I backed out, careful not to make a sound, and slipped into the truck. I drove out of there fast as the mud would allow, heart hammering, headlights slicing through the fog. I didn't stop again until I hit the interstate. At dawn, the sky paling behind the ridges. I never told anyone about Fletcher Hollow. Not the photograph, not the cabin, not the footsteps. I don't even know if the place exists on any map, but I think about it more than I'd like. Every time I drive through those mountains, I feel it, the weight of unseen headlights pressing close, the memory of that road vanishing into solid rock, and I still wonder if I was supposed to stop, if that photograph on the guardrail wasn't left for me to find. All I know is something waits in those hollows, something human, but wrong in ways I can't put into words, and if I ever see those headlights again, I don't think I'll make it out a second time. I've been running loads through the Appalachian backroads for years. The mountains are a stubborn maze of switchbacks, old coal towns, and fog that clings low and heavy, especially in the fall. That night I was taking Route 19 down past Summersville, heading toward an overnight stop in Beckley. It was late, close to midnight, and the rain had just started again, misting across my windshield, making the cliffs on either side seem even darker. That's when I saw him. A lone figure on the shoulder, thumb pointed stiffly toward the road. He wasn't waving, wasn't pacing, just standing there like he'd been planted in the mud. I don't usually stop for hitchhikers, not out here, but something about the sight of him, soaked through, a pack slung over one shoulder, made me ease down on the brakes. His face looked pale in the beams of my headlights, his hair plastered to his forehead. When he climbed into the cab, the first thing I noticed was the smell, wet wool, earth, and something else, like stone dust after a blast at a quarry. He didn't shake the water off, didn't apologize, just sat down and clicked the seatbelt with a deliberate slowness. Headed where? I asked, pulling back onto the road. He didn't look at me, just stared out the passenger window, into the black where the cliffs dropped into unseen hollows. "Junction's fine," he muttered finally. His voice was low, scratchy, like it hadn't been used in a while. We rode in silence. My wipers kept up their rhythm, and the truck groaned around tight curves. Every so often, I'd glance at him. His eyes weren't moving with the scenery. They were fixed, locked onto the same dark point outside. He never shifted in his seat, never touched the pack at his feet. The road narrowed through a stretch where old cabins slumped against the tree line, their roofs collapsing inward like broken spines. The air smelled of wet leaves and mold drifting through the vents. That was when I noticed his hands. They were coated with a fine gray grit, like powdered rock. He kept them folded in his lap, motionless, fingers curled inward. "Long hike?" I asked, trying again. He didn't answer, just blinked slowly, his jaw clenching. Something about the silence began to gnaw at me. Truck cabs usually feel safe, engine humming, CB chatter buzzing in the background, but with him sitting there, it felt different, heavy, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't. When we finally reached the junction, an empty pull-off where Route 19 split toward Fayetteville, he spoke again. "Here's good." I slowed, shifting gears. He grabbed his pack, opened the door, and stepped out without looking at me. He didn't thank me, didn't say another word, just walked into the mist, disappearing almost instantly, as if the fog had been waiting for him. I sat there for a moment, truck idling, trying to shake the unease. Then my CB crackled to life. "Breaker, don't tell me you picked someone up back there." It was Wayne, another driver I knew from the run. "Yeah," I said, pressing the button. Guy looked like he'd been out all night. There was a pause, just static and faint voices crossing channels. Then Wayne's reply came through, flat and sharp. "Don't pick up hitchhikers on that stretch. Last one died in a landslide, 10 years ago." The words sank into me, heavier than the rain. I glanced back toward the fog, but the movement was gone, swallowed whole by the night. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself Wayne was just spooking me. Truckers swap stories all the time about haunted hollows and ghost lights in the trees. But the unease didn't lift. The road stretched ahead, empty and wet, and every turn of my tires sounded too loud. I kept thinking about the man's hands, dusty gray, like he'd been digging, and that smell, like stone dust and wet clay, still lingered faintly in the cab. At my stop in Beckley, I should have collapsed into the sleeper and gotten a few hours of rest. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the image of him sitting stone still beside me etched in my mind. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. Over coffee at the diner, I asked Wayne what he'd meant about the landslide. He looked at me like I should have already known. "Back in 09, he said, "couple hikers went missing up near the cliffs past Summersville. They were caught in a slide after a week of heavy rain. Search crews only found one body. Other guy was never recovered." The way he said it, "never recovered," sat wrong with me. I didn't mention the grit on the hitchhiker's hands, or how he'd stared out at the cliffs. That afternoon, before I headed out, I checked the passenger seat. The cushion was damp, as expected, but there was something else. A faint outline smeared into the vinyl, like a dusty handprint pressed deep into the fabric. I brushed at it, but it didn't come off. The days that followed blurred into miles of road, but the memory wouldn't leave. Every time I passed that junction, I slowed without meaning to, my eyes drawn to the fog. Once, in the corner of my vision, I swore I saw someone standing by the guardrail. When I looked again, the shoulder was empty. I never told anyone else about it. Not my dispatcher, not the other drivers. But when I'm out on those roads alone, the silence thick around me, I sometimes catch myself glancing at the passenger seat, and I imagine him sitting there again, soaked through, eyes fixed on the cliffs, carrying that dust from the mountain, like it never let him go. It's been years, but I still avoid that stretch whenever I can. Not because I'm afraid of picking up another hitchhiker, it's because I know if I see him again, I won't be able to drive past. I'll stop, and I don't think I'd ever come back down the mountain. I had been driving since morning, weaving through narrow passes and switchbacks in the Appalachian Mountains. By nightfall, exhaustion had already set in. My rig rattled over an old county road where the lines had long faded, and the fog moved in so thick it felt like driving through milk. I passed no gas stations, no diners, just the dark silhouettes of ridges pressing close to the road. When I finally came across a gravel pull-off tucked beside a wall of pines, I decided to park for the night. The lot was bigger than I expected. Flat ground, scattered with wet leaves, bordered by tree line on all sides. No signs, no other vehicles, no lights, just empty. I cut the engine, and the silence came down heavy. The air smelled of rain-soaked dirt and old wood. I climbed into the sleeper cab, pulled my jacket around me, and tried to convince myself it was safe enough. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept noticing small things. The faint smell of mold when the heater kicked on, the way the gravel had crunched strangely under my tires too soft, like it hadn't been driven over in years. But fatigue won out eventually. I don't know how long I slept before I woke again, heart pounding like I'd heard something. I checked the clock, 3:04 a.m. The cab was pitch black, save for the dim glow of the dashboard. Then came the sound, slow, deliberate crunches on the gravel outside. Footsteps. I froze, holding my breath. My first thought was a ranger, checking on me, or maybe another trucker pulling in. But the steps didn't move in a straight line. They circled, slow, dragging crunches, uneven, like someone was limping. I slid closer to the curtain, just enough to part it with 2 fingers. At first I saw nothing, only fog drifting through the tree line, pale in the moonlight. Then my eyes caught the ground near my front tire, long grooves etched into the gravel, curling around the truck in wide arcs. Not footprints, drag marks. Something or someone had been circling me while I slept. I didn't move, didn't open the door, didn't even breathe too loud. The crunching stopped after a while, but I couldn't bring myself to check again. I just sat there in the darkness, jacket pulled to my chin, staring at the clock tick from 3:04 to 3:45, every minute drawn out like an hour. When silence finally settled back over the lot, it wasn't comforting. It pressed in thicker than before, like the trees themselves were listening. By dawn, I convinced myself I'd imagined half of it. Maybe it was an animal, a bear scraping the gravel. Maybe I'd been dreaming. But when I stepped out into the morning mist, I saw the truth. Those long, arcing drag marks circling my entire truck, overlapping again and again, like whoever made them had nowhere else to go. I left the lot without even checking my tires. The fog lingered well into the morning, hanging low over the hollows as I wound down the road. I couldn't shake the image of those marks around my truck. The wheel hummed beneath my hands, but my grip stayed too tight. By noon, I found a fuel station outside a place called Mill Branch. Small town, population maybe 100. The station was half convenience store, half bait shop, the kind with sun-faded posters taped to the door and a bell that jangled when you stepped inside. The clerk was an older man with gray stubble, standing behind the counter like he'd been rooted there for decades. I bought a coffee just for something hot to hold. "You parked out last night?" he asked, glancing at the mud on my boots. "Yeah, gravel lot off County 12. Looked empty." He frowned slightly, like the words meant something I didn't understand. "Ain't much out there anymore." I didn't push, just nodded, left a few bills on the counter, and went back to the truck. But his tone stuck with me all the way down the road. That night, I stopped again, this time at a truck stop with other rigs lined up in neat rows, engines idling like a lullaby. I told myself I'd feel safer surrounded by other drivers, and for a while I did, until around 3 a.m., the sound came back. Not footsteps this time, more like a soft scrape, a dragging across the asphalt outside my cab. My body went cold. I forced myself to look, just enough to peer through the curtain. Between the glow of the overhead lamps, I saw faint streaks on the pavement, the same long arcs I'd seen in the gravel. They looped between trucks, weaving, circling. I couldn't see anyone making them, but I could see where they ended, right beneath my rig. I stayed still until morning. When the sun came up, I checked. The marks were faint, almost washed away by dew, but they were there. Arcs, loops, circling lines, stopping at my tires. None of the other drivers mentioned anything. No one even looked down. I told myself I wouldn't stop again in these mountains. I'd push straight through, no matter how tired. But that wasn't the end of it. Sometimes, even now, when I pull into a lot at night, I feel it. The quiet, the weight of the trees. I'll check the ground in the morning, and there'll be faint drag lines near my tires. Never deep enough to prove anything, but always there. I don't know who or what walked around my truck that night in the mountains. I don't know why the marks keep finding me. All I know is that I can't sleep easy anymore, not at 3 a.m., not anywhere the silence feels too heavy. Because once you've seen someone circle you in the dark, once you've heard them dragging something just outside your door, you never really stop listening for it. I'd been on the road for 12 hours when I pulled into the rest area, just above Boone. The highway that night was a strip of ribbon climbing the spine of the mountains, the trees heavy with fog that bled down into the hollows. The GPS blinked me into a small turnout with a single concrete picnic table and a squat restroom building that smelled faintly of old disinfectant and mildew. It was the sort of place truckers avoid when it's daylight. At 2 in the morning, it felt like somewhere the map forgot. I'd intended to nap an hour, stretch my legs, then push on to the next way station. The cab of my rig was cluttered with the usual things: thermos with cold coffee, a pair of muddy boots, a paperback novel with a dog-eared spine. I rolled the window down a crack for the fog, thinking the damp air would help me sleep. The mist smelled like wet oak leaves and burned brake pads. Somewhere down the valley, a barred owl called once and then was silent. I woke because something tapped the glass. It was 3 light knocks, deliberate, like somebody rapping their knuckles against timber. For half a second I thought it was a branch, the wind, the truck settling, any ordinary thing. Then it came again, slower. My heart climbed into my throat. I fumbled at the seatbelt and peered through the windshield into the white soup of the rest area. There was nobody outside. The picnic table was a darker shape in the fog. The restroom's light was off. The gravel was slick and unmarked, save for the faint tread of my truck's tire and one set of boot prints leading away toward the tree line. I told myself I'd do what I always do: stay inside, keep the door locked. I turned the engine over to produce heat, let my phone's flashlight sweep the shoulder of the road. Nothing revealed itself. Then I saw the handprints. They were on the inside of the passenger window, right at eye level. 2 palms, pressed hard enough that the fog on the glass had parted in streaks. The smears were edged with something darker than water. Where the fingers had dragged, the streaks looked like a smear of thick mud. The prints were spaced like a man's hands. They leaned outward, fingers splayed, as if someone had been looking out or trying to push the glass. I remember sitting very still and watching my own breath fog. The air in the cab. The hands were inside. The thought made my skin go cold because it didn't add up. I hadn't opened that window since I fell asleep. I hadn't gone outside. I kept telling myself that hadn't gone outside, because to admit another possibility felt like stepping off a cliff. I fumbled for the flashlight, then paused. The flashlight beam showed the smears better. The fingers were painted with the dark of mud, and maybe something else. A thin reddish halo at the edges that vanished in the light, but showed up in the corner of my eye like a stain on memory. I wiped at the glass with the sleeve of my jacket until my arm tingled. The smear left a streak, and then a small ragged smear on my sleeve that smelled of wet earth. Along the door frame, where the inner trim met the glass, there was a smear of the same darkness, a thumbprint, half rubbed. It looked like someone had dug their nail into the seal, like they'd been trying to open the door from inside the truck. I checked the cab methodically, keys where they belonged in the ignition, my phone on the dash, the novel still where I'd left it. No fresh mud on the floorboard, none on the driver's side mat. The passenger seat was unoccupied, the belt buckled, a thermos still warm from earlier coffee. But then tucked under the passenger seat where I couldn't see it until I reached in, was a folded scrap of paper. It was a torn page from a grocery list, damp and soft. On the paper was a single word written in hurried print: remember. There was no handwriting I recognized. I kept the paper in my pocket and told myself I'd toss it later, toss it like the rational thing it was, but my hands shook so badly, I could barely fold the list back. The tapping stopped. The only sounds were my own breathing, and far below the road humming with tires passing a long way off. I drove out of that rest stop with the window cracked and the scrap of paper burning in my pocket. The fog clung to the cab like a wet shawl, and for the whole stretch down the mountain I kept glancing at the passenger window, expecting to see fresh handprints. I kept expecting to see a face reflected there, looking back at me the way a mirror when you're not fully awake. By the time I crossed over into the next county, the sun was only a suggestion, the fog thinning into a gray smear. I tried to shrug the memory off as fatigue, as a trick of sleep-deprived senses, but even after coffee and a shakedown at the next truck stop, The feeling that something had been inside my cab persisted, a pressure that sat behind my sternum like a pebble you can't dislodge. That night I parked at home and slept with the curtains closed. The scrap of paper lived on my bedside table. I told myself I would forget it. I told myself I had every reason to. But in the dark, when rain tapped the roof and a distant train sang through the valley, I would wake, heart pounding, and picture those palms pressed to the inside of my window, fingers spread into the fog. Something about the way the smears were dragged, purposeful, hurried, wouldn't let the image go. The rest stop was a small place on a map with a wooden sign and a number, but I began to think of it as a hinge. Whatever happened there had shifted something in me, though I couldn't name what. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I told myself that taking the interstate the next time would be the sensible thing. A week crawled by and the scrap of paper yellowed at the edges on my nightstand. Then a call came in. One of the regulars had a load that needed splitting, and that route took me back through Boone. Money has a way of convincing you to walk into the fog. I pulled into the same turnout with my headlights cutting forks through the mist. The rest area looked smaller under the dim sky. The picnic table a silhouette. The little restroom building canted and paint peeled like an old tooth. This time I parked with my cab facing the woods. I wanted to be able to see the tree line, to catch anyone coming down the slope. There were no handprints on the glass when I looked. The windows were clear. Maybe the fog had wiped them away. Maybe wind had smudged them into nothing. Maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing. The temptation to chalk it up to stress nagged at me like a splinter. I got out of the truck and walked the edge of the parking area. The gravel was soft and muddied from recent rain. I found the boot prints leading toward the tree line. One set, heavy, like a man's. They headed into the pines and faded under pine needles. I followed them as far as I dared. The woods were close and smelled of moss and rot. The ground springy underfoot. A raven called twice, and then nothing answered. Near a fallen oak, I noticed a rusted can half buried in the mud. It had been crushed and kicked aside, but caught in its lip was a small square photograph. I drive a flatbed through the mountains, more than I care to admit. The work is simple. Haul, deliver, sleep in the cab, repeat. There's a rhythm to it that steadies you, unless one night in late October, when the damp seems to have its own weight, and the world feels like it might slip right off the ridge. I'd been running a short haul from Boone down toward Wilkes County, a load of treated beams bound tight under tarpaulins. The road over Brushy Fork climbs and drops in quick, hungry curves. The brakes heat faster than you think on the long descents. At a turnout where a faded sign read Old Mill Way, 3 miles, I pulled off to let the drums cool. The fog was low, rolling through the hollows like slow water. The trees around the turnout sat black and still, wet needles glowing faintly where my marker lights caught them. I cut the engine and sat for a moment, listening. The silence in the mountains at that hour is a living thing, not empty, but full of small sounds. A distant river, the soft creak of a spruce, the occasional snap of a twig. Tonight there were also the slow breaths of my own truck, metal settling, tires sighing against gravel. I climbed down, boots sinking into the wet shoulder, and walked the trailer's length, checking straps, tracing each tire with a gloved hand. The air smelled of sap and wet earth, with a faint sweet rot from an old fallen tree nearby. I'd just finished feeling the hub on the rearmost axle, when something in the shadow under the trailer moved. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or a possum sliding beneath the boards. A small animal flattened against the cold metal. Then I saw the shape straighten, and in the dull cone of my flashlight, a woman crouched there, knees up to her chest, head turned, looking straight at me. Her face was thin, the kind weather and cold make. Her hair hung damp and dark over one shoulder. Her coat was soaked through and smeared with the brown of mud. She didn't speak. She just watched, fingers splayed on the gravel beside her, like she'd been holding herself to the earth. The sight of her crouched there, so still, so utterly human, hit me with the jolt of something impossible in an otherwise ordinary night. "Hey," I said, softer than I meant to. She didn't blink. Her eyes were wide and bright in the beam, but they held no pleading, no complaint. They simply held on to me as if she'd been expecting me all along. I blinked. When my eyelids opened, there was nothing under the trailer. No coat, no hair, no curve of a shoulder, only a smudge in the gravel where my light caught dust settling, shifting like someone had just been disturbed. The air smelled the same. The fog curled slow. The only thing that remained was the damp impression in the earth, the dust still falling where she'd been crouched. My heart climbed into my throat. I bent down and pushed at the gravel with my boot. The soil flaked away in dark clots and left a faint scuff like the heel of a shoe, as if something or someone had been there and left while I blinked. I ran my palm over that scuff until my skin went numb with cold. Whatever I'd seen had been real enough to wipe at the ground. I went back to the cab and sat down hard, hands trembling over the steering wheel. The turnout felt suddenly small and exposed, like a stage. My breath fogged in front of me, steady and human. The woman had been under my trailer. I'd seen her, and I hadn't moved fast enough to catch her. I told myself a dozen practical things to keep panic at bay: fatigue, low light, tricks of the fog. I checked the peripheral roads with the flashlight. Tracks ran from the tree line to under the trailer, boot prints, shallow and wet. Then the trail grew faint and lost itself in the moss. No footprints led away from the spot toward any road. There was a scrap of fabric caught on a root, red thread snagged and frayed, damp and stiff. I folded it into my pocket because I didn't know what else to do with it. When I climbed back in, the truck felt too loud. I drove harder than usual, the brakes whining until the engine seemed to carry all the freight of the night. I told myself I'd deal with it at the yard, that rational men in neon vests would make sense of the dirt and stray cloth. But all evening, and in the long sleepless hours that followed, the image of that woman crouched beneath my trailer replayed, not frightening in a horror movie way, but in the way a stray shard of memory can unsettle you, familiar enough to be true, impossible enough to be wrong. The scuff in the gravel, the dust that still fell, those were tangible. They wouldn't let me write it off. I couldn't explain why someone would be under my trailer in the middle of a mountain turnout at 2 in the morning. I couldn't explain why she had looked at me like a man she'd been waiting for, and I couldn't explain the hollowness that lodged under my sternum and refused to leave. Something about that night had slipped loose, and I drove away with a small chipped piece of red thread in my pocket and a dread I couldn't name. The next morning, the mountains looked ordinary. Sun through thinning fog, geese on a half-frozen pond, smoke from a distant chimney. I told myself daylight would rearrange facts into sense, but the scuff on the turnout's gravel and the wet smear of fabric under my boot had the obstinacy of real things. They didn't dissolve under the sun. Work carried me on. Loads don't ask for explanations. I double-checked every strap at the mill in Galax, ran a wrench over axles until my hands ached. Still, that night's image lurked in every reflective surface I passed: a pasture gate, a glassed storefront, the chrome on a road sign. I told myself I was being ridiculous until I found the Polaroid in the glove box. It wasn't mine. The photograph was taken from outside my truck, close enough to show the wet curve of the trailer's wheel well and the dark shadow beneath it. The picture was blurred where someone's thumb had smeared the emulsion, but right at the center was the unmistakable shape of a crouched figure. She looked like she had when I first seen her, head tipped, shoulders hunched. Only now, when I held the photo up to the light, I could see the wet tracks in the gravel leading to her, and then stopping. I don't know how the photo got there. My first thought was that someone had snuck into the cab while I'd been cutting across a yard or grabbing a coffee. But I'd kept the keys with me all the time, and the signal that something had been wrong, the thread, the scuff, still sat in my pocket like a verdict. That evening, I took a different route home through the ridge country. The road narrowed into old logging tracks, flanked by collapsed cabins where moss had crept in through splintered window frames. I found myself pulled toward one of those cabins, the kind with a sagging porch and a faded nameplate, so worn it was illegible. Its roof was caved in a little, and the air around it smelled of long dead wood and something sharp under it, like metal gone to rust. On the porch lay a pair of boots, small and scuffed, toes turned inward, as if the owner had stepped out and never returned. Beside them, on a bench eaten with lichen, was a pile of things, a spool of thread, a worn photograph, a scrap of red cloth the color of the one in my pocket. Someone had placed them there with a careful human intent, as if arranging evidence or prayer. I picked up the photograph. It was of a woman standing at the edge of a field, looking toward a road that cut the ridge. The back of the photo had handwriting in a hand that looked like mine at night, a name, a date, and a line that read simply, "Remember where you left me." The line hit me like cold water. My chest hollowed out. I did not know the woman. I did not know the name. But the handwriting, that cramped, hurried script, felt like an accusation I could not answer. After that I slept badly. Days blurred. I would find a scrap of fabric tucked by a mailbox, a single boot print on the inside of a bridge's iron girder, a smear of damp on the underside of a trailer where condensation had been wiped away and then left to dry. Each discovery was small, insufficient to raise an alarm, and large enough to insist someone had been close to my life, watching parts of it only I thought private. Sometimes I caught myself counting the hours I'd slept the week before, the routes I'd taken, the places I could not account for. There were blanks, not wide gaps, but enough that a man who used a road every week could not say with certainty what he'd done at 2 in the morning here or there. Those blanks tasted like guilt. I tried, absurdly, to stitch them with logic. Maybe I'd given someone a ride and forgotten. Maybe I'd been drunk. Maybe a family member had been left behind in a life I'd walked out of. The haunting wasn't a single event, and it wasn't even entirely about fear. It became a slow accrual of unease, of self-doubt. I started to check my rig more than was necessary, to sweep the trailer with a torch, to iron the tarps until my hands trembled from cold. I found other Polaroids in odd places under the bed in a motel room, tucked beneath a napkin at a diner counter where I'd stopped for coffee. All showed versions of the same scene, a figure crouched in margins where I expected no people. Each note on the back read different things, half names, fragments, left her here, waits at the turn, don't drive past. Once, on a fog thick as wool, I saw a shape near the shoulder far ahead. I slowed, reflex, and felt the familiar prick of panic. It was only a stump, but my mirrors reflected the empty road behind me like a promise. The urge to stop, to walk back, to check under the trailer's belly was near musical. I drove on. Now, when the mountains fog in heavy and the pine sap smells sharp, there is a habit I can't shake. I press my palm flat against the cab window and look for the faintest disturbance in the glass, as if some remnant of that night might show itself on the other side. There is no neat explanation, no arrest, no confession, no tidy end. What I carry is the knowledge that something or someone has been near me in the night, close enough to leave a smear in the gravel, and a photograph on my seat. I carry a small piece of red thread in my wallet, and every once in a while when I am alone and the road hums, I find my hand rubbing the spot where the scuff sits on my palm. I think that's the worst of it, not the unknown woman crouched under my trailer, but the way the mountains taught me to live with doubt. They taught me to make room for things I can't explain, to drive on with them heavy in my pocket, and to learn to sleep with the knowledge that I may have left something behind, or left someone waiting, in the quiet places where fog gathers and keeps its own counsel.